On April 29, 1945, American troops liberated the Dachau concentration camp. Hours later, several German guards were executed by American soldiers. Some were in custody, others were attempting to surrender. None were brought to trial. There was no formally recognized surrender. The camp's chain of command had disintegrated, and SS personnel mingled with the prisoners. Executions took place at various points throughout the complex without visible coordination. There were no clear orders, nor were there any subsequent consequences. What did the soldiers see when they entered Dachau? What triggered those shots? And why did the High Command choose not to intervene? The death cars, the discovery that started the fire. On April 29, 1945, the US 157th Infantry Regiment was advancing toward Munich when it discovered a rail convoy next to a walled compound. 39 rail cars remained parked on the tracks, abandoned during the German retreat. Private Michael Thompson opened the first car. He immediately stepped back, overcome by a nauseating stench. His screams alerted other soldiers who approached to discover the contents that would forever alter their understanding of the conflict. Each car contained hundreds of bodies piled haphazardly. Most were skeletons covered in yellowish skin, dressed in striped uniforms or completely naked. Their faces bore expressions of agony, open mouths, sunken eyes, clenched hands clutching dead companions. The convoy was coming from Buchenwald, evacuated on April 7th on Himmler's orders. Its official destination was Dachau to redistribute prisoners. Allied bombings fragmented the railway system. The train was detained for more than a week, 3 days in Plauen, 2 in Hof, and 4 near Nuremberg. Without food or water, the prisoners died en masse from the first night. Survivors, later located, described a progression of horror that began with desperate thirst and evolved into cannibalism. The weakest died first, the sick, the elderly, and children. Their bodies remained among the living for days, decomposing as the train moved sporadically forward. When it arrived at Dachau on April 28th, the convoy contained 2,310 corpses and 180 critical survivors. The SS guards had fled during the night, abandoning the cars where troops would find them hours later. For the veterans of the 157th, hardened in Anzio and the Rhone Valley, this represented a new level of horror. Sergeant Robert Hayes wrote to his wife, "I have seen many men die in combat, but always with honor. This is different. This is death as an industrial product." The reaction was immediate. Soldiers who had shown iron discipline under enemy fire began to vomit. Others burst into tears. Corporal Jimmy Martinez walked away from the convoy and didn't speak for 3 hours. Military discipline broke down in the face of the impossibility of categorizing what was witnessed. These were neither legitimate casualties nor accidental civilian victims. It was evidence of a system designed to produce mass death with industrial efficiency. The SS prisoners captured near the convoy were no longer perceived as defeated military enemies. They became direct perpetrators of the massacre. The distinction between combatants and criminals vanished in the face of the evidence. The first acts of reprisal occurred uncoordinated. Lieutenant William Walsh ordered 4 German guards into the most heavily loaded car. He forced them to remain among the corpses for 10 minutes, then drew his Colt 45 and executed them one by one with shots to the back of the head. Private Eugene Sledge would recall decades later, "Walsh didn't yell or lose his temper. He was cold, calculated, like carrying out a court order. No one moved to stop him. It seemed like the right thing to do." At the same time, other soldiers executed German prisoners without consulting each other. Sergeant Daniel Murphy led a firing squad that shot 6 guards against a wall. Corporal Frank Towers used a bar to shoot 3 Germans fleeing among civilian workers. These acts, committed by soldiers from different units without coordination, set a precedent that would quickly spread. The discovery had temporarily suspended the conventional military code, replacing it with summary justice that they considered morally justified. Major George Stevens arrived an hour after the discovery. He found his troops in a state of agitation unheard of in regular combat. His report to the General Staff mentioned a temporary but complete breakdown of traditional discipline, replaced by an improvised moral code. Signal Corps photographs documented each car for evidence at Nuremberg, but they failed to capture the psychological impact on those who opened the doors, breathed the death-laden air, and touched the evidence of systematic extermination. Colonel Sparks understood he was facing an unprecedented situation. In his report to Colonel Desiderio, he wrote, "The situation has evolved beyond standard operational parameters. I require urgent guidance on the handling of enemy personnel in the context of apparent mass crimes." The answer came 4 hours later, when events had already taken an irreversible course. The discovery had transformed what should have been a routine release into an unprecedented reckoning. Surrender without command, the chaotic fall of the last SS bastion. The approach to Dachau followed no military protocols. There was no artillery reconnaissance, softening bombardment, or formal negotiations. The troops navigated a chaotic situation that would make it difficult to determine who had legitimate authority and who posed a real threat. The German chain of command had disintegrated days earlier. SS Obersturmbannführer Eduard Weiter, commander since 1942, had abandoned his post on April 26th without issuing contingency orders. He loaded his belongings into a requisitioned vehicle and headed for Austria, where he would be executed by fellow SS officers who considered him a deserter. Their escape left Dachau without recognized authority. Responsibility fell to Heinrich Wicker, a 23-year-old SS Untersturmführer, equivalent to a second lieutenant. He had arrived 2 weeks earlier, transferred from a decimated unit on the Western Front. His knowledge of the camp was superficial, his authority over the veteran personnel questionable. Wicker wasn't the only officer present, but he was the highest-ranking officer willing to take responsibility. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Bergen had chosen to remove his uniform and mingle with the prisoners. SS Oberscharführer Maximilian Weber had fled, taking the most compromising files with him. The situation became more complicated with the arrival of Victor Maurer, a delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who had crossed German lines on April 28th with Swiss diplomatic documents. Maurer, a lawyer specializing in humanitarian law, had been sent to facilitate the transition from Bavarian camps to Allied authorities. In Wicker, Maurer found an officer overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond his training. For 3 hours on the night of April 28th, he persuaded him to desist from carrying out the Sonderbehandlung orders from Munich. These coded directives called for the systematic elimination of all prisoner witnesses and the destruction of documentary evidence. The surrender proposal materialized when Maurer and Wicker emerged carrying a white flag made from hospital sheets. Their encounter with American troops occurred at 11:30 a.m. on April 29th, 75 meters from the main gate. Brigadier General Henning Linden, deputy commander of the 42nd Division, was inspecting forward positions when he was informed by German negotiators. His meeting with Wicker and Maurer was improvised and lacked formality. There were no military interpreters. Communication took place in Wicker's rudimentary English and Maurer's fluent French. Linden accepted the surrender without specific guidelines from the 7th Army. Manuals covered conventional military installations, but no protocols existed for operating concentration camps. His decision was pragmatic: accept immediate capitulation to avoid prolonged resistance. However, the surrender lacked fundamental legal elements. No formal minutes were drawn up. No terms were established regarding the treatment of prisoners. No delineation of responsibilities between the occupying forces and German personnel was established. No procedures for disarmament or the transfer of authority were defined. More problematic, the surrender did not extend to all German forces. While Wicker negotiated, approximately 560 SS members remained scattered. Many retained weapons and ammunition, others occupied defensive towers without clear orders. A sizable group had opted for individual survival strategies. Some shed their distinctive uniforms, adopting civilian clothes. Others tried to blend in with the freed prisoners, hoping to go unnoticed during the initial confusion. This fragmentation created a dangerous tactical ambiguity. The Americans could not determine who had participated in the surrender and who posed a threat. The lack of uniform markings made it impossible to distinguish between surrendered personnel, disguised combatants, and escaping collaborators. The first reports mentioned sporadic gunfire, though it was not possible to identify whether it was organized resistance, desperate gestures by isolated guards, or executions of prisoners to eliminate witnesses. This uncertainty increased tension among troops who were advancing under the presumption of incomplete surrender. Maurer's warning about uncontrolled armed elements amplified this perception. His exact words, recorded by Linden, were, "I cannot guarantee control over all guards. there are groups that can resist regardless of orders. The documents found validated these concerns. Orders dated between April 24th and 27th instructed final cleansing procedures, removal of sick prisoners, destruction of archives, preparation of defensive positions. Another directive from SS Gruppenführer Richard Gluck's authorized extreme measures to prevent installations from falling intact into enemy hands. Particularly disturbing was an April 27th memo that divided personnel into 3 categories: essential for evacuation to Austria, expendable, who could surrender, and compromised, who were to be eliminated to avoid testimony. This classification suggested plans for targeted killings independent of any surrender. The complexity became evident when, hours after the surrender, armed incidents continued. Guards in towers fired on prisoners who approached the barbed wire, carrying out prior orders without knowledge of the surrender. SS personnel emerged from underground bunkers carrying automatic weapons, creating brief clashes with American patrols. These episodes validated the perception that the surrender had been incomplete, fraudulent, or ignored by significant segments of the German personnel. This perception would justify violent actions against German prisoners who could have been protected by the surrender. The absence of a unified chain of command meant there was no valid interlocutor to establish rules on the treatment of captives. In conventional surrender, the highest-ranking officer would assume responsibility for subordinates and negotiate conditions of captivity. At Dachau, this position did not exist. The result was that each American unit had to improvise decisions about how to treat German personnel they encountered. Without clear guidelines and without protocols for liberating concentration camps, the interpretation of who deserved protection as a POW was left to soldiers processing the impact of the carloads of corpses. Dachau in flames, the courtyard where everything broke. At 2:45 p.m. on April 29th, in a rectangular enclosure known as the Coal Yard, the most documented episode of the liberation occurred: the mass execution of German prisoners in American custody. It is notable for the direct presence of a senior officer, the immediate intervention to stop the massacre, and detailed documentation. The coal yard was a 40 by 20 meter enclosure located behind the main camp, adjacent to SS administrative buildings. Its 3-meter-high brick walls and unique controlled access made it a suitable space for temporarily confining prisoners during processing. It had originally served to store fuel for boilers that heated German offices. Colonel Felix Sparks, commander of the 157th Regiment and a veteran of Sicily and Anzio, had designated this area as a staging point for captured SS guards for the first 3 hours. His decision reflected standard tactical procedures: separate prisoners according to their perceived danger, keep them under armed guard, and process them once the situation stabilized. During the morning, approximately 50 men had been led into the compound. The composition reflected the identity confusion of the surrender. 18 wore full black SS uniforms, 15 wore Wehrmacht uniforms without distinctive markings, 12 wore military-civilian combinations suggesting camouflage, and 5 wore completely civilian clothes. To guard the group, Sparks assigned Lieutenant William Walsh, a West Point officer with an impeccable record, accompanied by 8 experienced soldiers from Company 1. As a security measure, an M1919A4 Browning machine gun was mounted in a commanding position, operated by 19-year-old Private Richard Birdeye Palouche, who had no prior experience handling prisoners. The machine gun had been positioned on a mound that provided a full-angle view of the compound. Its presence responded to manual instructions requiring automatic suppression capability when guarding large groups. Palouche had been ordered to keep the weapon ready, but to fire only with direct authorization or if the prisoners began obvious resistance. Before leaving to attend to a medical emergency where released prisoners required treatment for hypothermia, Sparks gave explicit instructions. His exact words, recorded in multiple testimonies, were, "These men are prisoners of war under the protection of Geneva. It doesn't matter what they've done before. Any mistreatment will be punished according to the military code." The events unfolded 15 minutes after their departure. According to Corporal Henry Wells, a witness less than 10 meters away, several prisoners began to show increasing agitation. Some partially sat up, others loudly exchanged words in German, and a few looked toward exits, assessing escape. Tensions escalated when SS Unterscharführer Klaus Detmer, later identified by documents on his uniform, stood up, violating orders to remain seated. According to Wells, Detmer uttered a phrase in German that sounded like an instruction. Immediately, 4 other prisoners began moving to standing positions, creating a pattern that suggested prior coordination. At that critical moment, the triggering factor occurred. A single shot rang out from the northwest tower, 200 meters from the courtyard. The source was never determined. It could have been a German guard without orders to surrender, an American sniper striking an unidentified target, or the accidental detonation of abandoned ammunition. Paluch, inexperienced in tense situations involving prisoners and unable to distinguish between genuine threatening movements and normal signs of anxiety, interpreted the combination of German movements and outside gunfire as a coordinated escape attempt or rebellion. Without requesting authorization from Walsh, who was at the opposite end supervising other guards, and without issuing any warnings, he immediately opened fire. The first burst of 3.06 caliber rounds shot toward the center of the group, initially hitting Detmer and the 4 who had stood up. The impact knocked them down instantly, but their falls and screams created widespread panic. Some tried to run to corners for cover, others threw themselves to the ground, seeking non-existent cover. These defensive moves fueled Paluch's misperception that a massive escape attempt was unfolding, requiring suppression with maximum lethal force. He continued firing systematically, raking the area with sustained bursts that emptied tape after tape. According to witness accounts, the young man seemed disconnected from reality, caught in a spiral of violence that had lost touch with any real threats. Walsh, positioned at the southeast corner when the shooting began, did not immediately intervene. His inaction would be the subject of later analysis, but testimony suggests he experienced seconds of paralyzing shock before grasping the situation. When he did react, he began shouting orders to cease fire, but Paluch did not respond to verbal commands. The sound of the M1919A4 firing continuously immediately alerted Sparks, who was 300 meters away overseeing medical operations. The distinctive rate of sustained automatic fire, distinguishable from the sporadic gunfire that had characterized the morning, indicated intense combat requiring immediate intervention. Sparks abandoned his activities and ran to the courtyard, arriving 3 minutes after the shooting began. The scene surpassed any situation he had encountered in 3 years of combat. Paluch continued firing at fallen bodies while screaming incoherently in a complete psychological collapse that had cut him off from rational consideration. Sparks's intervention was immediate and physical. He lunged at Paluch, violently kicked him away, knocking him to the ground, and manually disconnected the feed mechanism to permanently cease firing. His action prevented a major massacre, although it came too late for most of the victims. The result: 12 German guards killed instantly by multiple shots, 17 wounded to varying degrees. Several would lay in agony for hours afterward. The scene presented shocking carnage in any context, but especially disturbing when it involved surrendered prisoners in formal custody. Sparks's reaction was immediate and protocolary. He ordered urgent medical attention for all the injured, separated Paluch for psychiatric evaluation, temporarily relieved Walsh pending investigation, and prepared a detailed report that did not omit compromising aspects. Its official classification was clear: unauthorized use of lethal force against non-combatant prisoners in U.S. military custody, openly acknowledging a violation of international military law. Paluch's medical examination revealed extreme fatigue with acute psychological shock. Specialists determined that prior exposure to atrocities had caused mental destabilization that manifested under pressure. This evaluation would prove crucial to avoiding legal proceedings. General Charles Banfield received a full report. His assessment was pragmatic, an individual act, unplanned, contrary to established orders, and halted by command intervention. This characterization allowed the episode to be classified as a security incident rather than a systematic violation. What distinguishes this episode is precisely the presence of the commander and the intervention to stop it. Sparks didn't cover up the incident. He honestly reported it as a transgression he himself had stopped. The revenge of the freed when the kapos were judged. While soldiers carried out reprisals against German guards, another form of summary justice was taking place in the barracks. The released prisoners began their reckoning with the capos, prisoners selected by the SS to exercise internal control over other inmates. The capos represented a perversion of the concentration camp system. They were prisoners selected to perform administrative control and repressive functions over the general population. In exchange for maintaining strict order, organizing forced labor, distributing rations, and participating in selections for experiments or executions, they received privileges that meant the difference between survival and death: additional rations, better preserved clothing, occasional access to sanitation, less crowded accommodations, and a greater chance of survival. Most had evolved from victims to executioners over years of adaptation. The process began with a basic need for survival, but progressed towards psychological identification with their oppressors, which allowed them to exercise extreme violence against their fellow sufferers. Many had developed personal sadism that surpassed the coldest violence of the German guards. Franz Koziel, the capo of Barrack 15 and responsible for selecting prisoners for hypothermia experiments, had developed a system of torture that included depriving weak prisoners of blankets during winter nights and forcing them to sleep naked on the frozen ground until they begged to be included on lists of volunteers for experiments. His method guaranteed a constant supply of experimental subjects. Stanisław Grzesiuk, the Polish capo of the crematorium detachment, had turned the distribution of rations into a system of sexual extortion, where female prisoners were forced to submit to his demands in order to receive enough food to keep their children alive. Those who refused saw their rations reduced to levels that guaranteed death by starvation. With the arrival of the Allies, the capos became more vulnerable targets in the liberated camp. Unlike German guards, who could attempt to flee or surrender to American authorities, the capos remained trapped among prisoners who were intimately familiar with their specific crimes. The identification was instantaneous and executed with a precision that reflected years of observation motivated by survival. The prisoners vividly remembered the individual who had singled out relatives for selection, the one who had stolen medicines intended for the terminally ill, the one who had raped women in exchange for protection, the one who had beaten children to death for minor infractions. The first documented incident occurred in Barrack 7 at 1:20 p.m. 8 Hungarian prisoners identified József Vamos, the capo responsible for distributing drinking water. He had sold access to clean water in exchange for valuables for 2 years, condemning those who couldn't pay to death by dehydration. The Hungarians dragged him to the communal latrine, where he was submerged in excrement until he suffocated. Simultaneously, in Barrack 12, Jewish survivors from Thessaloniki executed Dimitrios Papadopoulos, a Greek capo who had helped select more than 300 of his fellow countrymen for transport to Auschwitz. They used ropes taken from mattresses to slowly strangle him, prolonging the agony for 20 minutes while reminding him of the specific names of each victim. In the women's section, Polish prisoners located Irina Kowalska, the capo who had run the clandestine brothel where the SS forced selected women into prostitution. Kowalska had developed a system where she reported women who attempted suicide to escape forced prostitution, guaranteeing public execution as a warning. The Polish women skinned her alive using shards of glass, replicating torture methods she had suggested to German guards. Sergeant Peter Gallery of the 222nd Regiment documented in his diary the executions he witnessed during his shift. His entry for April 29th described the death of Anton Müller, the Austrian capo in charge of the hospital who had participated in the murder of more than 500 prisoners by lethal injections of phenol under the guise of medical treatment. Müller was captured by prisoner doctors who had survived his selections. They led him to the operating room, where they immobilized him on the surgical table using the same straps he had used to restrain victims. They proceeded to perform on him, without anesthesia, the same progressive amputation experiments he had conducted for months on conscious prisoners, documenting each phase with the same scientific sadism that had characterized his work. Medical Captain Marcus Smith recorded at least 17 bodies with signs of prolonged torture, all identified as capos for their particular cruelty. The methods varied according to the criminal specialty. Those who administered poisons were poisoned, those who practiced strangulation were strangled, and those who systematically beat were beaten to death. The violence transcended revenge to become ritualized symbolic justice. Each execution specifically replicated the methods the capo had used against other prisoners, creating moral symmetry that survivors considered essential to restoring the balance disrupted by years of reversing natural power relations. The American response was deliberate inaction. Soldiers trained in the proper treatment of prisoners and the protection of civilians witnessed multiple executions without attempting to stop, document, or report them. This inaction was not the result of ignorance, but a conscious and morally calculated decision. The soldiers understood that legitimate justice existed, transcending formal legal considerations of military law. They had witnessed the system of horror that had been at work. They could identify victims and perpetrators. They recognized that intervening to protect collaborators would have constituted a second victimization for those who had already suffered years of systematic torture. Lieutenant Jack Hallowell provided revealing testimony about this tacit collaboration. On the afternoon of April 29th, a Dutch prisoner identifying himself as Dr. Willem van der Berg approached, requesting a weapon to protect himself from German guards who might remain hidden. Hallowell, without investigating his true intentions or consulting with him about proper protocol, provided him with a confiscated Luger. Hours later, he learned that van der Berg had used the weapon to locate and execute 3 specific medical capos: Heinrich Stolz, responsible for selecting patients for euthanasia, Rudolf Kemper, who had extracted dental gold from living prisoners, and Klaus Weber, who administered lethal injections to children. Van der Berg's strategy reflected a sophistication that transcended impulsive revenge. He had tracked down each capo individually, confronted them with specific lists of victims identified by name, and executed them using the same methods they had employed. This dynamic extended to junior German guards who tried to blend in with the liberated prisoners. Some had discarded distinctive uniforms and adopted the clothing of deceased prisoners, but the survivors' memories were remarkably accurate. In the crematorium area, Soviet prisoners identified Wilhelm Brenner, the Unterscharführer responsible for supervising the execution of Russian prisoners by shooting them in the back of the head. Brenner had adopted a striped uniform and blended in with the freed prisoners, but was recognized by Ivan Petrov, a survivor who had witnessed his brother's execution on Brenner's direct orders. The Soviets led Brenner to the main crematorium, still warm from the morning's operations, and placed him alive into the combustion chamber. His screams were audible for several minutes. The prisoners considered this appropriate because Brenner had ordered wounded prisoners who were still breathing to be burned alive when they arrived at the crematorium. The soldiers justified their non-intervention with arguments that revealed sophisticated moral understanding. The prisoners had a legitimate moral right to settle accounts with their torturers. Any formal justice system would be inadequate to punish crimes of such magnitude. Halting retaliation would have meant protecting the obvious perpetrators of atrocities. Colonel Sparks took a different position regarding prisoner executions, contrasting it with his intervention to stop the shooting in the courtyard. He acknowledged having witnessed several incidents without intervening, explaining, "There was no adequate moral framework to protect those who had voluntarily and systematically participated in the administration of this organized hell." The extent of these reprisals was never officially recorded. Later estimates suggest that between 40 and 70 capos were executed during the first 24 hours. Added to these were approximately 20 minor German guards identified while trying to escape by blending in with the freed prisoners. The formal reports focused on operationally relevant aspects: the number of prisoners released and their medical status, the organization of emergency medical care, documentation of facilities for future court proceedings, and the implementation of public health measures to prevent epidemics. The deaths of capos and junior guards were systematically omitted, classifying them as internal matters that did not require military intervention. This lack of documentation has complicated historiographical reconstruction. Only through personal testimonies, private diaries, and later interviews has it been possible to establish that the executions of collaborators represented a significant dimension of the violence during the liberation. The reckoning revealed a form of justice that operated according to moral codes developed within the concentration camp system itself. For those who had experienced years of degradation and terror, the opportunity to reverse power relations represented not only revenge, but a fundamental reaffirmation of their recovered humanity. Silence in the high spheres, the order to be silent. The violent events at Dachau were known to the US Army leadership within 6 hours. Detailed reports of summary executions, including casualty estimates and descriptions of methods, reached the 7th Army before midnight on April 29th. Eisenhower was notified through classified channels. Despite detailed documentation, direct testimony from officers present, and photographs showing clear evidence, the High Command made a conscious institutional decision not to open legal proceedings against anyone responsible, not even preliminary investigations that could establish individual responsibility. This decision did not arise from ignorance or negligence, but from a complex process of strategic considerations involving legal, political, diplomatic, and symbolic factors of great international complexity. Eisenhower's first report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, transmitted at 8 a.m. on April 30th, used deliberately ambiguous language that would become standard. His cable, classified confidential limited distribution, stated that forces had successfully liberated and completed the operational clearance of the Dachau camp, where approximately 32,000 prisoners were liberated, and 300 SS guards were rapidly neutralized during securing operations. Neutralized allowed for multiple interpretations: successful captures, legitimate casualties during combat against resistance, or summary executions, without specifying the actual circumstances. This formulation fulfilled the regulatory obligation to report relevant facts, but avoided creating problems that could complicate other operations or compromise the moral standing of the United States. At the same time, Eisenhower ordered exhaustive documentation of the conditions found. Signal Corps teams were explicitly instructed to record every aspect of the complex: functioning crematoria with partially charred remains, railroad cars containing corpses, medical experimentation facilities, barracks crammed with dying prisoners, and files documenting the systematic nature of the genocide. Congressional delegations were rushed to the air on military flights to witness the evidence. Accredited journalists were given unrestricted access with expedited transmission facilities. This concentration of resources on documenting Nazi horror established priorities: direct all attention to enemy crimes, not to possible violations by liberating troops. It was a narrative control strategy that anticipated future debates about the Allied moral legitimacy of trying Nazi criminals in international tribunals. Any acknowledgement of summary executions by American soldiers could be exploited by defense lawyers at Nuremberg to argue moral equivalence, compromising the legal basis of the entire post-war judicial system. General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, received detailed reports from Colonel Sparks on the courtyard shooting and other incidents. His assessment, in a classified memorandum to General Patton dated May 3rd, stated that although technically violations of military law had occurred, extraordinary operational and psychological circumstances made any judicial proceedings that might set problematic precedents inappropriate. Patch argued that prosecuting soldiers for acts after discovering genocide would set a dangerous precedent exploitable by enemy propaganda, compromising the Allied moral standing and undermining American authority to lead denazification in occupied Germany. More strategically, it would compromise the moral authority needed for Nuremberg, already planned as the legal foundation for the post-war peace. Patton, known for his direct style and distinctive conception of military justice, supported this assessment and provided additional arguments. His reasoning, expressed in confidential communications, combined practical considerations with convictions about warfare and the morality of combat. Patton believed that concentration camp guards had automatically lost protection under Geneva by participating in mass crimes against civilians, arguing that they had ceased to be legitimate combatants and had become common criminals who did not deserve the consideration normally granted to regular prisoners. The most influential legal assessment came from Colonel Leon Jaworski, 7th Army Legal Counsel and future Watergate prosecutor. In a confidential 23-page memo dated June 15th, Jaworski analyzed all the legal implications and judicial precedents involved in prosecuting soldiers for specific events at Dachau. Jaworski acknowledged that executions of surrendered prisoners constituted violations of the laws of war under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, but argued that justice and equity do not require undertaking the extremely difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility under these historically unique circumstances that transcended any known legal precedent. His analysis emphasized the lack of precedent for judging military reactions to the direct discovery of extermination camps in operation. Existing military codes, developed for conventional combat between regular armies, did not contemplate scenarios where professional soldiers were suddenly confronted with evidence of systematic genocide operating with industrial efficiency. The memo established specific mitigating factors: lack of formally acknowledged surrender, creating ambiguity about the legal status of those captured; persistent presence of armed German elements maintaining active combat conditions; immediate psychological impact of discoveries, exceeding conventional military preparedness; absence of premeditation; distinguishing acts from calculated crimes; and direct intervention by senior officers to stop executions, demonstrating that they did not constitute official policy. Neither technically justified the executions from a purely legal perspective, but they provided context that made morally understandable and administratively justifiable the decision not to prosecute soldiers who had acted under extraordinary pressures without historical precedent. The position was crystallized in a June 20th Joint Staff Directive establishing all events as administratively closed without judicial proceedings, criminal investigations, or disciplinary reviews that could create compromising records for future use by enemies of the United States. This decision was communicated discreetly through classified channels without public announcements or statements to the press. The objective was to maintain a controlled ambiguity that would allow flexibility based on future foreign policy needs. The terminology adopted in official records reflected this policy of controlled ambiguity. 7th Army reports, reports to the Pentagon, and administrative documentation classified incidents using neutral formulations: unauthorized use of force during security operations, neutralization of hostile elements in exceptional circumstances, control incidents during objective security, non-standard situations resolved on the ground. These formulations avoided compromising terms such as execution, massacre, war crime, or violation of conventions, which could be used by lawyers, journalists, or foreign governments to question American moral authority in post-war international affairs. The soldiers involved were handled with administrative discretion. The yard gunner was declared unfit for combat and transferred for psychiatric evaluation without criminal charges. Walsh was reassigned to administrative duties away from the front, retaining his rank without visible disciplinary proceedings. Others were transferred without penalties appearing on permanent records. This approach allowed for implicit acknowledgement of violations without creating problematic documentation for future investigations or related proceedings. Soldiers were removed from situations where they might repeat the acts, but without processes that would establish legal precedents or generate documentation that could be used by defense lawyers for Nazi criminals. Sparks not only avoided discipline, but was subsequently promoted. His intervention to stop the shooting was interpreted as responsible leadership under extreme circumstances. His report, while acknowledging disciplinary violations, emphasized their unplanned nature and his intervention to limit them. The policy of silence continued for decades. When journalists inquired about possible summary executions at Dachau, the official Department of Defense response was that there are no documented records of incidents of this nature. This position held until 1989, when Sparks offered the first official acknowledgement in an interview with the Army Center of Military History. The declassification of documents in 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the liberation, confirmed that the High Command had known from the outset and consciously chosen not to act. Memos from Patch, Jaworski, and other officers revealed the deliberative process that led to the administrative closure. Unlike other massacres, such as Biscari in Sicily, where American soldiers were prosecuted for executing Italian and German prisoners, Dachau was treated as a unique situation requiring special considerations. The final assessment was that prosecuting soldiers for reactions to the discovery of extermination camps could establish unrealistic expectations about human behavior under conditions that transcended any conventional military preparation. The case set a domestic precedent for how to handle military infractions committed under extreme psychological conditions, reflecting recognition that certain situations could break even the most carefully trained discipline without necessarily constituting an actionable institutional failure. Functional hell, Dachau before the Allies arrived. To understand why soldiers trained in military law executed surrendered prisoners, it is essential to examine what Dachau was at the time of its liberation. A fully operational industrial death machine, a systematic complex designed for dehumanization, criminal medical experimentation, and mass extermination of human beings according to the racial, political, and eugenic criteria of the Nazi state. Dachau was the Third Reich's first official concentration camp, established on March 22, 1933, 47 days after Hitler's rise to power. Heinrich Himmler, then police chief of Munich and future architect of the concentration camp system, personally announced its opening, describing the facility as the first concentration camp for political prisoners designed to protect the German population from subversive elements. Initially conceived as a temporary detention center for immediate opponents, communist leaders, social democratic leaders, prominent trade unionists, and critical intellectuals, its function evolved into something more sinister. During its 12 years of operation, it became an experimental laboratory where the SS developed, perfected, and systematized methods of psychological control, scientific torture, and efficient extermination that would be implemented throughout the European concentration camp network. The camp served as a training center for the SS Totenkopfverbände, Dead Skull units, which would later administer Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bergen-Belsen. The methods developed, from psychological humiliation techniques to mass execution procedures, were codified in official manuals distributed throughout the system as operational standards. From 1933 to 1945, more than 200,000 people were officially registered as prisoners. This figure represents only a fraction of the total population, as it does not include those who were executed immediately without registration, those who died during transports, those transferred for immediate execution, or thousands who simply disappeared from records without explanation. The camp functioned as a multifunctional complex, combining a political prison, a forced labor center, a criminal medical experimentation facility, and a mass extermination center, depending on the regime's changing needs. This evolution reflected Nazism's own transformation from a conventional authoritarian system to an unprecedented genocidal machine. The infrastructure reflected its evolution toward industrial death. The original 1940 crematorium, built to handle the dramatic increase in mortality, was replaced in 1942 by Barracon X, a facility designed by specialized engineers that included 4 high-capacity industrial furnaces capable of incinerating 150 bodies daily when operating on a continuous 24-hour shift. A fully functional gas chamber was built next to these ovens, equipped with a specialized ventilation system and hermetic sealing mechanisms. Although its systematic use for mass extermination remains a subject of historical analysis, there is clear documentation of its use for targeted executions and experiments with Zyklon B under medical supervision to study the physiological effects of different chemical concentrations. The accounting records found intact revealed the industrial dimension of the extermination. During April 1945, the archives documented more than 4,000 processings, a bureaucratic euphemism for executions or catalogued deaths, with peaks of 250 bodies processed daily during the week before the Allied arrival. These numbers reflected the accelerated implementation of preventive cleanup orders from Munich to eliminate witnesses before inevitable capture. The terminology used, Sonderbehandlung beschleunigen, accelerate special treatment, and Spuren beseitigen, eliminate traces, had been developed to linguistically camouflage the reality of mass murder. When the Americans entered on April 29th, they found crematoria operating actively under orders received the night before. The technical staff, led by Maximilian Grabner and his Sonderkommando team, had been instructed to maintain continuous incineration until the Allied arrival in order to destroy evidence. The furnaces operated at maximum capacity in continuous shifts, processing not only the bodies of recently executed prisoners, but also disinterring and rescinding corpses from mass graves dug when cremation capacity had been insufficient to handle the volume of deaths produced by accelerated extermination policies implemented since January 1945. A disturbing dimension was the official program of medical experimentation on living humans. The research hospital was a series of specialized wards fully equipped with state-of-the-art surgical instruments where experimental procedures were performed without anesthesia, consent, or regard for the well-being of subjects used as laboratory material. These experiments were not marginal initiatives of individual doctors, but official programs coordinated and funded by prestigious scientific institutes of the Reich, recognized German universities and armed forces, which provided specific funding, imported equipment, and regular technical supervision by university professors and high-ranking military doctors. The hypothermia experiments, directed by Dr. Sigmund Rasche under the supervision of the Luftwaffe Medical Research Institute and funded by the Air Ministry, systematically immersed selected prisoners in tanks of ice-cold water maintained between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius to study the limits of resistance to extreme cold and develop resuscitation techniques for downed pilots in Arctic conditions. The subjects, selected from young, healthy prisoners to ensure scientifically valid results, were kept until unconsciousness or death, while medical teams recorded vital signs, physiological reactions, body temperature changes, and exact survival times. The data was statistically tabulated and sent to the Luftwaffe Institute for the development of improved survival equipment. The atmospheric pressure experiments used decompression chambers built to aircraft industry specifications to accurately simulate high-altitude conditions and the vacuum of space. Prisoners were subjected to pressures equivalent to 20,000 meters until they suffered severe air embolism, convulsions, and death by asphyxiation, while the physiological effects of rapid depressurization were studied. The procedures were filmed in detail using professional cinematographic equipment to document physiological reactions during progressive agony, creating a visual archive that was kept as research material and sent to aeronautical medicine institutes for analysis by civilian and military doctors. The malaria program, directed by Dr. Klaus Schilling under authorization from the Ministry of the Interior and in collaboration with the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, deliberately infected prisoners with different strains of Plasmodium falciparum and Vivax to test the effectiveness of experimental treatments with synthetic quinine, atabrine, and other antimalarials developed by the German pharmaceutical industry. More than 1,000 prisoners were used as subjects over several years of research, most of whom died from complications of infection or the toxic effects of chemical treatments administered without regard for lethal effects. The results were published in German medical journals as legitimate contributions to scientific knowledge. Mass sterilization experiments, coordinated with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, tested methods for implementing eugenics programs on conquered populations deemed racially inferior. High-intensity X-rays, chemical injections with silver nitrate and other caustic substances, and surgical procedures developed for rapid mass administration were systematically used to develop techniques that could be applied to millions of people in occupied territories. The administrative documents found included regular correspondence with scientific authorities in Berlin, weekly technical reports on results with full statistical analysis, bureaucratic requests for additional human resources for planned research, and detailed budgets for equipment imported from German universities and hospitals. This documentation demonstrated that the experiments were not uncontrolled local initiatives by doctors motivated by sadism, but rather integral components of nationally coordinated scientific programs, systematically funded by the Nazi state and academically supervised by Germany's most prestigious medical institutions. The morgues, examined by US military doctors for days after the liberation, contained hundreds of bodies with clear physical evidence of experimentation carried out in the hours and days before the Allied arrival, surgical amputations without medical justification, systematic removal of internal organs for analysis, signs of dissection in living subjects, marks of multiple experimental injections, surgical sterilization procedures without anesthesia. Some corpses bore tattooed numbers that corresponded exactly to specific experimental records in medical records found, allowing for precise identification of the procedures performed on each individual and the physicians responsible for their execution. The general conditions at the time of liberation were beyond adequate description. The barracks, designed to house a maximum of 500 prisoners in Spartan but habitable conditions, routinely housed up to 2,500 people in overcrowding that eliminated any possibility of dignity, basic privacy, or healthy survival. The inmates slept either stacked on wooden bunks built in triple tiers without mattresses or blankets, or directly on the dirt floor atop layers of excrement, vomit, dried blood and organic waste that had accumulated over months without the possibility of cleaning. The lack of sanitary facilities, only 12 latrines for more than 30,000 prisoners, had turned the barracks into centers of disease and death that perpetuated themselves through constant contagion. Epidemic typhus spread unchecked among a population weakened by extreme malnutrition. Thousands showed advanced symptoms, a constant fever above 40 degrees Celsius, permanent delirium that kept them semi-conscious, extensive skin rashes covering the entire body, and severe dehydration that had reduced their bodies to skeletons covered by translucent skin. Malnutrition was widespread and had reached levels that military doctors described as the most extreme documented in modern medical history. Prisoners had lost between 40% and 60% of their normal body weight during periods of internment that stretched for years, reducing normal adults to spectral figures of less than 40 kilograms. Many were terminally starved, physically unable to stand, perform basic bodily functions, or chew solid food. Medical Captain Howard Wilsey documented the conditions in a report that would become a seminal historical document. Widespread malnutrition with starvation edema evident in 90% of cases examined. Universal prevalence of infectious diseases, exanthematous typhus, pulmonary tuberculosis, chronic dysentery, pneumonia. Extensive evidence of systematic physical abuse, multiple poorly healing fractures, intentional burns, surgical mutilations without medical justification. Conservative estimate: 15,000 individuals require immediate hospitalization to survive the next 72 hours. The administrative facilities revealed the systematic nature of the institution's operation as an extermination center. Files organized in specialized offices documented every operational aspect with accountant-like precision, detailed arrival records with photographs and biometric data, racial classifications based on pseudo-scientific criteria, specific job assignments based on prior professional skills, periodic selections for medical experiments with scientific justifications, and scheduled trials with specified dates and methods. This documentation demonstrated that Dachau did not function as a makeshift detention center or chaotically managed camp, but rather as an industrial human processing facility operating according to standardized procedures, established schedules, and specific quantitative productivity goals measured in terms of efficiently processed deaths. The most disturbing documents were operational directives dated days before the liberation. One specific order, dated April 26th, instructed complete evacuation and final clearance of the compound, using technical terms that intelligence analysts identified as coded instructions to systematically eliminate all prisoner witnesses and destroy compromising documentary evidence. Another directive of April 28th, signed by SS Gruppenführer Richard Glucks from the headquarters of the concentration camp system, ordered that all scheduled cremations be accelerated, non-essential administrative documentation be immediately disposed of, and explosive charges be prepared to destroy key installations if the complete evacuation of German personnel could not be completed before enemy arrival. When American troops entered Dachau on the morning of April 29, 1945, they did not simply liberate a prisoner of war camp where honorable enemies had been detained according to established military protocols. They actively disrupted the workings of an industrial death machine that had operated with systematic and uninterrupted efficiency for 12 full years from the earliest days of the Nazi regime to the very moment of its final collapse. Crematoria were firing up and processing bodies according to established schedules. Medical experiments continued to proceed according to scheduled scientific protocols. Daily execution selections were ongoing under medical supervision, and final mop-up orders were being partially implemented by technical personnel working against time to eliminate evidence before the inevitable arrival of Allied forces. This objective and fully documented reality provides the essential context for understanding the immediate reactions of the American soldiers during the crucial hours following their entry into the complex. They had not entered a defeated military installation where honorable enemies had surrendered according to established conventions of warfare between civilized nations, but an active crime scene where industrial genocide continued to operate up to the very moment of their discovery. The discovery that Dachau was a fully operational extermination camp fundamentally and irreversibly transformed the soldiers' perception of the nature of the conflict they had been waging for years. The realization that this was not a conventional war between national armies with limited political objectives, but an existential confrontation between the basic principles of Western civilization and a system of industrialized barbarism that had reached levels of systematization unprecedented in human history.